Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Silver Lining for Learning. This is Scott McLeod. I'm your main host for today from CU Denver. Our other two co-hosts today are Yang Zhao from University of Kansas and Kurt Bonk from Indiana University. We are very fortunate to have with us somebody whose name has been on the lips of P-12 educators all around the world for years, but particularly over the last few months. As I said in our blog post describing with us today, Dr. Catlin Tucker's name has been on the lips of more than anybody else that I've heard for the last 6 months. We're very delighted to have Catlin with us today. She's an award-winning author and educator and been helping schools all around the world. She's got some awesome resources that are come out, so please be sure to check out Balance with Blended Learning in Action, Power Up Blended Learning, and all the other books that Catlin has that can really help you sort of make sense of remote instruction and how to do it well. And I'm just going to say this before we dive in, that one of the things I really appreciate about Catlin is that she's really focused on meaningful and powerful learning within blended and online environments, the kind of learning that we, the hosts of Silver Lining, really care about. She's not just about sit and get and drill and kill and automated chunking of digitized textbooks. So we're just absolutely fortunate to have her with us today. Catlin, thanks for joining us from California, giving up part of your Saturday.
Absolutely. I'm happy to be here with you all.
Woohoo! So Catlin, let's start with the first question, which is just, what have you been seeing the last 6 months? Like, what's going on out there?
Yeah, this summer and the spring have been very, very busy, and it's interesting because I'm seeing all kinds of things. I'm seeing a very small group of schools that have decided we're going to prepare teachers for, I think in their minds, the worst case scenario, which is all online. And so really getting into the weeds around strategies to be successful in the online environment. And then I saw a lot of school districts really waffling this summer, hoping they were just going to go back face to face, and then not really doing a lot with their teachers around the training. And so a lot of teachers, unfortunately, even after the quick transition in spring and having a summer, not necessarily feeling very prepared to re-enter the classroom, which is unfortunate. And, you know, in my kind of listening on Twitter and interacting with educators there, also getting the sense that, you know, teachers are being put in some really challenging situations. It's not even just that they're facing, you know, we might be all online or we might be all in the classroom, and both of those are anxiety inducing, but it's even teachers who are now trying to do this crazy dance of, I have kids in a classroom and I have kids synchronously online, and now I'm somehow, you know, trying to figure out how to do this dance of keeping everybody engaged. And so just a lot of frustration and fear. And, you know, I think no matter how long teachers have been in this education, everybody feels like a new teacher right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Catlin, I have a follow-up on that. Thank you, Scott. Blended learning since COVID. Blended learning is a thing that emerged in the early 2000s. In Canada, they called it mixed learning. In the corporate settings and military, called it hybrid learning. And blended's come in and out of vogue, you know, from various times. But since COVID, has your message changed? And what brings people hope? What brings teachers confidence? And maybe what brings transformation? So how's the message changed? Hope, confidence, and transformation.
Okay, I'm going to do my best to hit all of those, and then you tell me when I missed one.
Skip whatever ones you want.
Okay. Honestly, I don't know that my message around blended learning has changed. For me, I know you can go online, you can get the big definition of what blended learning is. And from my own research, I did a lot of digging into kind of the way in which blended learning since 1999 really has kind of evolved and changed, in the way the higher education has kind of interpreted that versus the way it's interpreted in K-12 is very kind of different as well, the way it's interpreted and it's implemented. And so for me, my focus has always been active engaged learning online combined with active engaged learning offline, face-to-face in a classroom. And that takes lots of different forms. Blended learning is very much this like umbrella term. It's like oddly flexible and tries to encompass all the ways in which these different combinations happen. But for me, I want it to position the learner at the center of learning, and that learner needs to be an active agent. And my big concern right now, if we're being honest about blended learning being thrown around in the COVID context, is it's like, oh, we're doing some stuff online, we're doing some stuff in class, it's blended learning. And my message has always been blended learning at its core is a shift in control from teacher to learner. So if that teacher still has a really strong grip and controls all parts of that learning process, to me, you can call it blended learning, but the value of what blended learning can be in an educational context isn't being maximized. So for me, I really want teachers to focus on, yes, we might be working with kids exclusively online, but if we believe in blended learning, then how are we integrating offline learning into that scenario as well? How are we honoring experiential tactile learning, even if that learning is happening at home in this remote learning scenario that we're all in? So for me, I don't know that my messaging around blended learning has changed, but I think I'm really trying to hit that active, engaged piece, and let's position that learner at the center. And how are we doing that?
I got that from reading your book this afternoon, parts of the book, and I clipped the 3 pages, and it's exactly what you're saying right now. You talk about changing the partnership, and that's a word that comes over and over again in the book, the learning partnership. And we could address this later, but, and in fact, I was planning on bringing this up later, but this is the heart of what you're speaking about. We're trying to motivate, engage, and give feedback, and then the assessment piece. But there's quotes I clipped, I could read them, but you've read your own book, so I don't need to read them necessarily. You know, I've got a handbook of blended learning in 2006, but it's worthless now. It's what you're talking about here today is really about that, changing the education model in what we can do today, what we can do right now.
Yeah, which is interesting because like obviously that came out in January, right before this moment we're all in. But I think that idea of in this moment really honoring the students as these partners in the learning journeys that are happening, and believing that kids are capable, that they can think about their learning in very intentional ways, that they can begin to appreciate their progress and identify when they get stuck. Like we need to pull them into that. The teacher shouldn't feel responsible for doing all of that for everybody. Like so much more meaningful when students take an active role in that part of the learning.
Catlin, let me actually jump on that. We talked about this. I love this message because I'm all about students taking over around the whole show. So I'm really curious. Since COVID, do you see more teachers taking on that message, trying to have students develop their own learning pathway and in collaboration with the teacher, with adults? Do you see more learner capability and learner autonomy?
I mean, we should, because that's one of the benefits of the online learning, right? Online learning, agency, autonomy, flexibility, like those are the benefits, and let's tap into them. But no, I'm not seeing that. I think, we're in this moment where maybe we'll see some really positive changes and shifts in this year ahead. When we talk about silver linings, I will speak to that. But I think in spring, there was a real scramble. And I understand teachers didn't have warning, they hadn't been trained, no preparation. And what I observed was a real focus on dissemination and collection. Like, how do I get assignments out to kids? How do I collect assignments? That's not the art of teaching, right? And so I think we're moving from this scramble of we've been thrown into this environment and we had to kind of make it work for a few months. And now we're entering a new school year. And my hope is that some teachers will lean into that opportunity to think about, how do I utilize the benefits of this space? Yes, there are challenges to online learning, of course, but there are benefits. And how do I tap in and maximize those benefits to do exactly what you're saying? Giving learners more control, more autonomy, doing skill building around things like stretching those metacognitive muscles, right? So they can own that experience more.
So, Catlin, again, I love the vision of what blended and online learning could be. I got to confess, I'm not seeing it in most places. And, I'm struck by something you said earlier, which is that and I've been blogging about this too, is that we had all summer to get ready for this. And it almost feels like we're in the same situation this fall that we were back in, February, March-ish in most places, where we seem to be scrambling again. We don't seem to have made the necessary investments over the summer to get ourselves ready for this moment. And so, a lot of that has to do with systems and politics and lack of leadership and, whatever. But I'm also struck that, your definition of blended learning isn't everybody's, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of like the battle around what does personalized learning mean, right? Like we have a whole bunch of people and actors fighting over what that term means. And there's some really powerful forces that are working against your definition of blended learning. So I wonder if you could talk about what you think some of those are and what do we do about them?
Yeah. Oh God, that is such a great question. There are so many ways. I agree. My focus on this active, engaged piece is not everybody's focus. And even just in finishing my own doctoral work, one of the things that I was writing about is just how this designer role, our role is like the architects of learning, experience, and education, how that designer role is both really cognitively stimulating and positively engaging for teachers, and how it can be challenging and negatively engaging for teachers. But my fear when we talk about blended learning on one end is that then you have like big companies and prepackaged curriculum moving in and like taking over, and then not allowing teachers that creativity, but kind of sidelining them. Instead of getting to be designer, facilitator, instructor, they're just kind of, they're in that facilitator role and they don't get that creative design component. So I have fears around that. I also have a little bit of nervousness around how we spend our time in those synchronous moments versus how we spend our time in the asynchronous moments. So I wrote a blog. I think it's the one that's up right now, actually. And I got a really kind of rude comment where it was like, you must never have been a teacher. Like, how can you say this? Because I had basically said, synchronously, let kids explore, let them engage with information in different kinds of forms. And then when you're together, spend your time doing the things that really don't work as well online, right? Like giving real-time feedback, conferencing with kids, engaging kids in conversation. And so I worry that in this kind of scramble to figure this out, that actually that face-to-face time will be spent talking at kids. And I'm like, that is not what I want. That's not the best use of that limited time. And so I have a lot of fears about the ways in which this term is being co-opted. And then it was written about in a magazine, and somebody tagged me, and they were talking about, well, it means this percentage of time online versus this percentage of time offline. And I'm like, that's been highly debated in higher ed over the definition. Like, I want it to be more fluid. So yeah, it's as with anything, there's people who want to interpret it one way to kind of meet their ends. And that does concern me, because I think that the focus isn't on the kids then and what's best for learners.
There's a lot of myths on blended, and that's just one of them. How much should I blend?
Yeah.
42% or 43? It doesn't matter, people. You can web supplement and have improvements in the classroom in terms of learning and other outcomes that take place, or go nearly fully online. There's been a study of this, the amount or percent to blend, did in a Pew study in large section undergraduate classes, and 30 courses were looked at. 25 out of 30 showed test score improvements, and the other 5 showed no differences, and all 30 showed improvement in completion retention rates. And it didn't matter whether it was a small blend or full-on blend or some kind of optional face-to-face meetings,
Yeah.
So I'm really glad you made that point. But there are other myths too. What is blended
that
learning?
Could be a
definition?
whole episode.
Oh yeah. What administrators say is blended and what teachers say is blended totally varies, because a teacher is talking about putting a debate online that wasn't quite finished in class. That's a blend. That's not a blend to an administrator though, and they're blending time on campus. But anyways, I go on. Scott might want to address something from the audience here.
So I have a question before. I think what I actually was very interested in what Catlin, you are saying is the student piece. So the student take leadership, the student talk, whatever that thing is. So I was just wondering, by the way, you are the one perhaps out of our group who has the most experience in the K-12 classroom. You've been a teacher longer, I think, right now. So I respect that. So I'm looking for some silver lining out of your mouth to say, so what is it when you try to work with teachers? How do you help them change that? Whether it's blended or not, it almost doesn't really matter. It's the idea that you drive space in teaching to enable students to be in charge. So what kind of things you've done that that's effective, that's helping teachers to transform and change fast?
I honestly think the best way to help teachers, it's funny because when you ask teachers, and I ask them this all the time, how would you define a positive blended learning kind of experience from a student perspective? Or how do you define a positive online learning experience from a student perspective? Teachers are the first to say engaging, interactive, fun, not so much talking, like from the teacher. Like they point out all of these things, they know. And then so I will put them, if I'm lucky enough to have them in face-to-face, great. We do blended learning models in our workshops. If we're online, I try to model best practices there. But it's really putting them in the seat of the learner and having them move through some of these models, some of these experiences where they're built around them. And then they realize how interactive, how engaging those moments are for them as the teacher in that learner's seat. And then we start to think about, okay, what could this look like in your classroom? And I advocate for kind of like a start small and then go build from there, just because teachers, some teachers get really excited and they want to make all these changes and then they try it out and it's a total disaster, because that's what learning's all about. You try it, you make mistakes, you learn, and you try it again. And so we start small. And it's so funny because once teachers have that one success, they do something and they observe their students, they treat their classrooms like a laboratory, and they really start to understand what's working for kids, what's not, collecting feedback from their students about the student experience. I think they start to really understand that those values that cause them to answer the question, what is a positive student experience? All those things they identify but don't always show up in a lesson. They start to think about, wow, if I planned differently, if I let kids kind of engage and control this piece, then look at what they're doing and look at how they're responding and look at what they're saying to me in their feedback. So one of the things is have them experience these models, these blends as a student, and then have them step back and do a little metacognitive kind of reflective piece on it, but then also really encouraging them. Are you creating feedback loops from student to yourself? Are you really trying to learn from their experience what's working, what they're responding to, what they might need to be adjusted or, improved?
Thank you. Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, so Catlin, we have a question from one of our regular audience members in India, actually. And he said he wants to know, if we have a bunch of teachers who have not gravitated towards giving kids control and agency and ownership of their learning in a face-to-face classroom, how on earth do we get them to do that in a blended or wholly online space, right? It's going to be a real struggle to get them to understand the power and potential of that if they weren't even doing it when they had kids in the classroom in front of them.
No, I agree. I think it's unfortunate. I mean, the folks who dipped their toes into this blended learning water before COVID are probably in a much better position right now to be thinking about that. Although what's fascinating is, and I understand here in the States, I have no idea what the expectation is in India. I would imagine it's very different. But in the States, you now have school districts saying you have to be in synchronous sessions with students for 80 minutes every day, right? Like, we are trying to replicate the school day online. And I don't think that's the case in a lot of places. So as teachers are pushed into this position where they have to say, okay, I have X amount of time with my students online in terms of video conferencing. And then the rest of the time, they have to kind of navigate some of this asynchronously. Almost by function of that need for asynchronous components, they do have to release some of the learning over to kids. it doesn't necessarily mean kids get choice and voice around what they're doing. I would love that to be the case. But at least they have some control over the pace at which they work, obviously their time and space. So what I hope is for those teachers who are kind of pushed to have to do those things to give students more control in that asynchronous part of the equation, I just hope that whenever we go back to the school classroom, that we don't then forget how effective those things could be.
Yeah, absolutely. And Catlin, you were recognizing different cultural or geographic contexts. One of our audience members in the YouTube space noted that in other countries where maybe they might be lower tech or the education systems are more political or state-owned or autocratic, that it's harder for teachers to have the space and messaging and permission to give kids that kind of agency that we're talking about here, right?
Oh, absolutely. And even just the difference in the ways in which that is handled here, from some districts being very open and supportive of student agency, and others, being really locked down and not allowing teachers that freedom. It's always interesting, even here in the States, seeing the differences that exist.
Yeah, absolutely. And that leads us nicely into another question from one of our audience members, Scott Shellhorn, who says that, we do have these districts, they're worried about standardized tests and, accountability mandates and scripted curricula and whatever. And then what kind of advice do you give teachers and principals who are operating within those kinds of district or state contexts about how to maybe do some of this anyway, despite sort of those top-down pressures to be very, lockstep, standardized, test-oriented, et cetera?
Yeah, I have a lot of feelings about standardized tests and the way that tests and even just our traditional grading systems, the impact that they have on education. And I worry that the focus on tests, the canned curriculum, the strict pacing guides, they often don't allow teachers to be creative. They don't allow and really invite students to explore with any kind of depth. And so I know that the whole purpose is to drill down into specific skills. And I just worry that in that drilling down, and you end up losing, this is the loss of the creativity and the curiosity and all those things that feel like education should be nurturing. And so, I think there are ways to cultivate skills effectively in a blended learning model, but that whole drill and kill kind of mentality is really kind of breaks my heart.
So, Catlin, I have a question related to that. I think what Scott was asking about other systems. Students very well. Okay, so this is hypothetical. So we're all arguing for students to move forward. I was wondering, if you've seen a growing group of students take charge of their own learning, basically ignoring schools, they can run their own blended learning, they can run their own hybrid learning, they're accessing information. Google just came up, Google Career Certificates. We have so many learning possibilities. Have you seen the rising group of students doing that?
I mean, I know that students are going out and pursuing their own learning. It may not be around the academic concepts that we have decided to value in the traditional education system, but it blows my mind. And even working with some of my own students, the amount of, time and energy and learning from videos and resources they're finding online to feed whatever their interests or whatever's driving their interests. So whether that is, something having to do, I had a student a couple of years ago, and she was just like, I'm going to be a social media influencer. That's what I want to do. And I remember having a moment of oh my gosh, that's a real job now. That's something that she's focused on. And she pursued learning about that and what was involved in that and studying other people in that in such a way that I had a moment thinking, school's valuable. There's a lot she's going to get out of this, but watching the intensity with which she's pursuing this learning that she cares about beyond the school setting, I thought, God, I wish there was a way to honor that kind of student-driven, student-selected learning and valuing it in this context of education in a way that we just don't right now.
Great, thank you. I think Punya was saying the same thing. Punya was just adding that in the comment saying that it's happening, but not in the same domain, because recently I've been doing quite a lot of research on called teen entrepreneurs. You see a lot of, a growing number of teens are managing their own business, running their shows, doing their own work. Well, Greta Thunberg is a great example. She ran, the global, kind of protest against climate change. So I think that's really, the reason I'm saying this, because it's changing teachers. It's definitely a good idea, helping them. But at the same time, we have a growing generation of youth who have access to all the resources we want them to have giving access to. And how can schools help those group to succeed in academics as well in other domains? Scott, go ahead.
Well, Young, I'll just add to that. So, because I'm interested in that issue too, right? Like the interesting things that kids do with technology at home. And I think one of the steps to helping our schools get started on that is to recognize and understand what kids are already doing in their local setting. So I remember doing a workshop in Charlotte, North Carolina, a couple of years back, where they actually gave me all their high school students in an auditorium for like an hour. And I was telling them stories of, like these teen entrepreneurs that you're referencing and the social, media influencers that Catlin's talking about. And I gave the students my cell phone number and said, text me things that you're doing at home that are interesting with technology, right? And I didn't have them posted on the screen because, high school kids, but they were texting me stuff. And, the stuff that they were sharing was phenomenal. Like I started my own business. I raised $20,000 for charity last year. I coordinated, this nonprofit that's giving out meals to people, like whatever. Like these answers just started flowing in. And the teachers and administrators around the edges of the room were just boggled that they knew about none of that. Like, this is all stuff that they did not know about their own students who they spent 7-8 hours with every single day, Monday through Friday, right? And so we have to start by just recognizing that in every school, this stuff is already happening, but we just don't even know.
Yeah. And not only do they have access to all this information, they have access to an audience, a global audience that they can cultivate, which is so crazy and amazing that they can get these businesses off the ground and do these phenomenal things and really connect with people all over the world.
Absolutely.
So Catlin, what's your secret? And by the way, if anyone wants to buy our newest book, 2020, it's Corwin Press. Balance with blended learning. Partner with your students to reimagine learning and reclaim your life. So it's an impressive title. I have a couple things. It's a 3-part, each quick. What's your secret? What enables you to be a hit in all these school districts? In browsing through it, it seems like a theory to practice. So you're establishing what you're trying to do from a theoretical grounding, but not too much. So what has caused you to be highly requested? I'm just curious.
I think I am definitely interested in the theory myself, though I know most of the teachers that I work with, they're like, I want strategies, I want resources, like I want the concrete stuff. And so when I am working with teachers, I think on some level I'm relatable. I've spent 16 years in a high school classroom. I've been a blended learning coach for going on 5 years now. So I'm with kids. I see all the challenges, all the things that teachers deal with. And so when I work with them, I really try to keep it as real as possible. Like, here are the realities. This is how we can kind of get these things done. Here's what you can expect. Here's how to troubleshoot. And so I think in part it's really, I honor their time. I know how valuable their time is. I want to maximize it. But it's just really strategy, resource focus. Like, here's ways to make this happen. Let's work together. Let's problem solve. And so I think that goes a long way with teachers.
Scott's got a follow-up for this one.
Yeah, so Catlin, looping back around to something I said I'd ask you before the show started. So what have school districts been having you help them with this summer?
Well, obviously, my expertise is in blended learning, and obviously online learning is a big part of that. I've been an online, I've taught online, and nobody's been interested really in the online part of that equation until like right now. Now everybody's trying to figure it out, right? And so one of the theoretical framework that my own work is kind of grounded in is this community of inquiry. And so I'm very focused on like, how do we create these communities online and really keep students as active agents? And so a lot of the work I've been doing is trying to help give teachers a structure in which to even just think about online teaching and learning, and then really talk about, okay, what are our roles and responsibilities in an online blended course? How do we help develop that social presence so kids feel comfortable leaning in and engaging and learning with and from each other? How do we structure these learning experiences to really help them, make and construct meaning together? And so it's been a lot of the online part. And then I very frequently get booked for blended learning and they're like, but for an online situation right now. So it's like, they want to know how to navigate this online reality, but then really like, I'm trying to make the concrete connections but when you go back, here's what this looks like if you are on a hybrid schedule, or if you're back in class and you really want to utilize blended learning strategies and models.
Well, Caitlin,
go ahead, Kurt.
You've taken a lot of methods that have been researched for a long time, like Jigsaw, for instance, and collaborative annotations and other kinds of things. And you've put them in a couple of blog posts so that people can operationalize them.
Right.
And this show is not about necessarily the hands-on doing, but it doesn't hurt to give people in the audience one or two things that do work. And I'm just going to briefly mention, I liked the word on the wall with Padlet. I liked the digital choice boards with Google Documents. I like the Flipgrid tell you how you solve the problem. Instead of what's the solution, talk about how you write. So it gets that metacognition. It seems like I'm circling through some of these ideas, the storyline where an actor reads a book or an actress reads a book, you have a concept map around it on key characters. So visualizing that kind of thing. You can see I've been reading a lot of these. The Google Map adventures, I could go on and on, but each one of them, I was able to use with examples with teachers in the Gulf region this past Monday, and I got good feedback. So your ideas do work. I'm curious if you got a couple of favorites and how people would operationalize them.
What's funny is I am online discussions is something that's like a staple in any online class. It's big in higher ed, right? Like everybody uses online discussions, and it kind of boggles my mind how rarely they're used at the K-12 level. And even at young grades, like, can we use Flipgrids for video-based discussion among younger kids who might have keyboarding skills? And how do we build in those asynchronous text-based discussions to connect? Like, I get a lot of teachers who are like, I don't know how to connect my learners online. I don't know how to get them having conversations. And I'm like, these are strategies that are so important for students to learn. And they're such a great way to bring kids together in the online environment. And it's nothing new. It's something we've been using, higher ed's been using consistently for years and years and years, and yet you're not seeing it. And I think part of that is really around fears, like they're scared of what kids are going to say online, which I totally get. I had that same fear when I started using online discussions with 9th and 10th grade students. So it's online discussions is a big one that I push, even though it's nothing new. It's nothing like exciting in terms of being outside the box, but that, and then also really pushing teachers or nudging, I shouldn't push them, I just nudge them toward where are those virtual spaces online where we can engage learners in collaborative tasks together, right? So when everybody's in these distance learning modes and they're kind of stuck at home and can't really go out and do a whole lot, like, where do we find those shared spaces online and really allow kids to work collaboratively to make the meaning, to do the research, become the experts?
That's a collaborative annotation of Google Documents. That's the Flipgrid discussions back and forth. That's what you're doing. So it's not just the technology, as Scott's pointing out here. It's the pedagogy that we've known for decades works, and finding the right marriage there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you actually, Catlin, thank you. You get me thinking about a lot of things I did not used to think, or I would not come to a question. So this is more of a conversational question. Really has to do with we call something blended learning or hybrid learning, because in my mind, learning is supposed to take all forms, all kind of technologies, all activities, all different kind of possibilities. Learning is learning. So just tell us a little bit about, I'm not asking to summarize the research or however people use this term, but just when we use blended learning, it has become a brand. A lot of people use it. And so the idea of blended learning, what does it really mean? You know, what does it mean? So if we just call it learning, would we have lost anything?
Actually, I think it's really funny that you say that, because I don't know, it's in multiple of my books where I have said, at some point, we won't call it blended learning. It's just learning, because technology is everywhere, right? We have all of this access to information and resources, and we shouldn't even have to have this term that encourages us to pull all those great resources into a classroom environment. But
Right.
blended learn, but the reality is it's not happening in a lot of classrooms. So I think blended learning models, right? All of these different station rotation, flip classroom, whatever, flip the flex model. They give teachers almost like a road to walk to figure out, okay, how do I weave these online learning pieces into this traditional kind of classroom environment? But it is all just learning. And
yeah, because I have nothing against it. I'm just that's just a thought that came to me to think about it. We use that flipped classroom. So we can. I think it for now, for the moment, it does serve a very powerful role to get teachers to move towards something. I think it is a powerful term. I know, Scott, you got a previous question. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's all good. So Catlin Punya asked a really great question in our chat space, which is that, schools are also supposed to be about exposing kids to the wonders of the discipline, right? Like, I didn't know I liked physics until I had physics, kind of idea, right?
right.
So how do we balance that? How do we balance sort of student agency and autonomy as learners and the ability to follow their own interests and passions with sort of societal or school system visions around, here's some things that we want you to learn about and at least be exposed to as part of growing up, so that we don't foreclose options for you later?
Oh, absolutely. And I guess in my mind, I don't see them as mutually exclusive, right? So like in an English class, I'm responsible for teaching maybe 5 or 6 texts over the course of the year. And so we're going to read Romeo and Juliet together. We're going to perform it. We're going to like get into the weeds talking about Shakespeare's life and Elizabethan England. But and some kids will love that experience. They'll realize they like performing when they have never done it before. They'll figure out this language that seems so foreign. But then there are these moments where the teachers have the choice to release to students, right? So if we're reading a text, we're reading Romeo and Juliet, and I want kids to have some historical context. I want them to know about Elizabethan England, but I don't need to control what part of that they want to learn about, right? You want to learn about crime and punishment. You want to learn about plague and other illnesses, or fashion, or gender roles, or entertainment. Great. You can do that, and you can hone your research skills, and you can collaborate with the group, and you can be the expert on this topic, and you can tell us about gender roles in Elizabethan England, right? So I think we can still expose them, but I almost feel like if we want them to be passionate about physics, or we want to see if they're super into whatever English language arts, then there has to be a degree of which they get to kind of chart their own path a little bit, right? Like in English, one of my fears is, reading is a really subjective kind of experience, right? I am part of a book club. I read all the books. I really like maybe every third book, but I read the books because I want to drink wine and talk about them with my friends. And so let's honor the fact that kids are going to enjoy different kinds of texts. And maybe once in a while, not every time, they get to choose the text, right? And then we still drill down into skills like how do characters develop, and let's talk about figurative language and theme and all that jazz. It's related to English and part of my curriculum that I have to teach. But let's focus on something you'd actually really enjoy reading, maybe like sci-fi, historical fiction. And so I just feel like there's this real absence of student choice, and like we just want kids to love it just the way it is, instead of realizing that there's all this flexibility within these umbrellas of topics that we teach or subject areas that we teach. And I'd love to see teachers maybe allowing that choice to let students understand the connections between classes, instead of we just learn English over here and you just do physics over here. It's like, let's blur those boundaries and allow kids to see these overlapping kind of elements of these classes they're taking.
Yeah, I mean, no argument here. So we just got to get teachers and admins to recognize that there's space in the curriculum for that, and they don't have to feel these coverage pressures that they always feel, right? So Catlin, let's shift gears slightly, because Chris raised the important issue of equity and access, right? So how do we work on blended or online models when some of our kids and families don't have access to devices and or adequate bandwidth at home?
Yeah, and I think that was a big part of the slowdown moving online in spring, is because you literally had school districts, and some in my area, sending out tech surveys and connectivity surveys like after kids were not coming to school. And for me, the amount of like opportunities and information that kids don't have access to when they're not connected, like I feel like those conversations, it should be about, how do we get every kid connected? How do we find out who doesn't have access? What are we going to do to problem solve around that as a school, as a community? And so what's maybe one of the benefits, and it's obviously not across the board, but even in my own area, like my two children are at a bilingual immersion public school, never been one-to-one. And all of a sudden this shift online, they were like, who needs devices? Who's not online? And there's been this huge scramble. And now every kid has a device and every kid is online. So in part, I think it's like, can we take some really proactive steps to figure out who needs connectivity, who needs devices, and how can we support those learners, those families? But I also think there needs to be an acknowledgement around using a variety of different kinds of strategies with kids who have different levels of access, so that, you know, they don't miss out because they can't be online for Zoom or Google Meet calls twice a week, and just approaching that with a little bit of flexibility around how we're making resources and assignments and things available to those kids and families.
Because if a kid's doing an inquiry project, for example, that doesn't require them to necessarily be online all the time, but they can still do that kind of work, right?
Well, yeah, and I think even as it's interesting. So I've been doing a lot of work with teachers around the 5Es instructional model, and how can we leverage that model for student-centered inquiry in an online learning scenario. And one of the things I point out during the explore phase is, I'm like, how do we get them exploring offline? Like, can they build a model and like tinker to learn? Can they do an experiment to test out an idea? Can they interview somebody and talk to somebody in their family to see if they can learn? Like, we don't just learn online, we learn offline too. Like, let's, in our rush to get kids online, let's not forget that.
Well, I've got a fun one for you, just to lighten the tone for a second anyhow. But I've printed out some blog posts of yours, and they're titled 10 Strategies Designed to Engage Elementary Students, which is a big deal today. When I talk to teachers, it's elementary students that people have real concerns about. You got 8 ideas designed for engaging students in active learning online. You've got 7 designed to increase student engagement in a synchronous classroom. You've got 5 tips for teaching online, and 3 strategies for remote and with study sync using Google Classroom. So my question is, have you ever thought of writing a book and having NASA as a theme and go 10, 9, 8, 7, you have lift off, you know, you've got most of them written here, you just get, but
I've never considered that, but that is not a bad idea.
You know, then you can walk teachers through. If they do these things, you get your class is done. No, on a little more serious note, of those blog posts that you've provided people, and they're brilliant. I used a couple of them, and they were, you know, really saved me last Monday. Okay. Are there 1 or 2 that you want to allude to our audience to that they might want to take a look at, that you've gotten a lot of feedback that's positive in nature, that you know, some or something that people are asking about that you're about ready to write a blog post on? What haven't you done that people are begging you to do?
So I would say that the blog posts that I've written in the last few months that have gotten the most traction are, so I did write a blog post very early on, I want to say even in March, about the 5Es instructional model, and just like really acknowledging what a beautiful model that is, you know, initially designed for a science course. But like, if you think about creating these student-centered, student interest-driven kind of inquiry cycles online, it's such a great model to use. So I kind of blogged about it one weekend, and it got a ton of traction, because teachers were just like, they were really looking for concrete strategies to do these things online. And then it was funny because I think very much with a secondary brain, because that's where most of my work was. So I did that 8 strategies for active learning online. And then I must have gotten like 24 requests, like, what about elementary? And I'm like, oh, my brain doesn't work as well in the elementary mode, when you haven't been the person in the classroom teaching, but I've done enough coaching in elementary. So then I developed that one. And I think the one that I'm wrestling with right now that I've gotten a lot of requests alluding to is this idea of like the concurrent, or the kind of like hyper flex, this idea of teaching a group online and a group in class at the same time, and trying to provide some strategies for how to do that successfully. I think it is
we're dealing with that at the higher ed level too.
Yeah,
High
it's
flex
such
models. Yeah.
I think it is the hardest scenario I can imagine. And so even as somebody who is very comfortable weaving together different kinds of learning environments and different kinds of engagement strategies, I'm just to kind of crystallize it for teachers has been really hard for me. But that's the one that's in progress right now that I feel like I want it to be super clear and usable, because I know there's a demand.
Well, read from Brian Beatty, my former student at San Fran State. He's developed the high flex model. Beatty, Brian Beatty.
Okay.
He's going all around the country. He was a K-12 teacher. He was in the Navy. He was, he's done everything. He's designed for corporate. So he's a pretty knowledgeable guy. And it's getting a lot of exposure, but it's the most difficult model that there is.
Add to that is that I wonder if we make it a little more difficult than it needs to be, right? Because the challenge with the high flex is that we're trying to do 2 different things simultaneously. We're trying to serve the needs of the kids in front of us with one model, and somehow pay attention to the kids who are on the camera remotely at the same time. And it seems to me that if we just designed everybody for online, right, and some kind of blended asynchronous model, right, then if you're lucky enough to have some kids with you in front of the classroom, you're checking in on them, you're clarifying misunderstandings, you're building community, you're dealing with social emotional health needs, whatever, right? But you can also do that with the kids who are there on the camera, but they're all doing the same work, rather than asking the teacher to do 2 different kind of work modalities for 2 different group of kids at the exact same time and doing double work. Thoughts on that, Catlin?
But that means we have to stop talking so much. We have to plan online lessons. I think you nailed it. Like, we can't plan a face-to-face lesson, which is what teachers are going to instinctively want to do because that's familiar, and then figure out how to like make some parts available for the kids online, or just have kids like watching what we're doing offline. Like, that's not going to be a successful learning experience. I think we have to build it as an online learning experience, and then pull pieces into the face-to-face. And then, like you're saying, connect with kids, engage in those conversations. And then I've even really been playing around with like the benefits of strategically grouping, so that as kids are moving through lessons, you have some kids online and some kids face-to-face, and they're in a group together. And sometimes they're navigating tasks together, and sometimes they're working asynchronously on their own, right? So, but just and I know as soon as I publish this blog, people are going to be like, you're crazy. That's not possible. But I'm like, it is possible. We have to believe it's possible in this moment. So yeah, I totally agree with you.
Yeah, and if we can have our students in our face-to-face classrooms collaborate with students in somebody else's classroom somewhere else, we can do the same thing for our own class, where we just treat the 2 groups just like we would 2 separate classrooms that are geographically separated, right?
Absolutely.
All right, Catlin, we got kind of 2 more big questions for you before we head into our grand finale here and introduce the next episode. One of them is around digital balance. So all of this seems to require a lot of screen time. So we've got educators, students, parents, and families who are worried about their kids spending too much time on screens. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, amen. I agree. I'm really worried about that. I'm watching my own 2 kids spend a ton of time online, and And I know it is a product of where we're at, but like even in the spring, I want to say it was April, like I had to say, I am an advocate of blended learning, online and offline. So even in a remote learning scenario, how are we prioritizing offline learning? So I wrote a blog about taking the station rotation model virtual. But in my blog, I provide a template, and there's a teacher-led station, there's an online station, which is online learning experience, and an offline station. And my messaging to teachers is encourage your kids to document that offline learning like they're creating a documentary of their experience, right? Like take pictures, record a video, because that documentation feels different than like staring at a screen and like interacting with a screen, right? So if you're going to build a model, if you're going to draw a picture, if you're going to like tinker, just document it or reflect on it, and let's build those pieces into our curriculum. Give kids a break from the screen, because I've seen what a sixth grader looks like after spending all day at the screen. My kid's eyes are like bloodshot. He looks like a little, I mean, he just looks like he wants to collapse, you know? So I think online is great, but there has to be a balance.
Yang, we're giving you the next question.
So actually, I want to ask this question, and I'm glad you asked that one, because I'm really, Catlin, I love the enthusiasm you have. You're like me. I said, well, if it cannot be done in every class, but at least let it be done in one class. So that's my view. Okay, if you cannot solve all people's problems, solve the problem of some people. So that's what I view. I think sometimes we create too big a problem for ourselves to say, well, what about this? What about that? If a solution solves one problem, be happy. Solves two, be great. Okay, so, if saves 3 students, nice. 5, even better. So that's kind of my attitude. I like what you are answering. So actually, my question is really, it's a chat. I invite all our audience to really think about this. What can we do? We know there's a lot of obstacles in what we try to do. Otherwise, we wouldn't be running this show. We wouldn't be doing what we're doing. Every one of us, we know we give a talk, we give a keynote, we give a address, people love it, they applaud, they do all kinds of things, So we are this show. We got a bunch of guys doing this show. So I would really like to hear from you, Catlin. What encouraging words you would give to people? And to people, I mean, like who are right now, the social emotional issues are big right now. People are really worried about opening school, closing school, reopening school, reclosing, all of those things. What kind of message from you as a teacher, as a person to help others to change their methods, as someone who deeply care about students and the work, what would you tell us?
I think
make it long. Okay, we want a long one.
I would say less is more, right? I think educators, there's so much change, and all we can do is the best that we can do in the moment we're in. We have to give ourselves some space and some patience, right? Like we're trying so many new strategies, and teachers are always doing the best that they can, right? So all we can do is as much as we can in this moment. So I think that less is more, giving yourself patience, like try one strategy, know you're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. It's just part of the process. And like, I'm a big fan. Tell kids, this is new to me. We're going to try this. I'm not sure how it's going to go. When we're done, let's circle up and debrief and see, is this something we try again? Is this something we modify? Is this something we kick to the curb? Like, I think in this moment, if teachers don't put pressure on themselves, like I have to know it all, I have to be the expert, and instead they just lean into this really uncomfortable space of, this is all new, we're all learning, we're going to do it together. I think they're going to not feel that anxiety to be perfect, to have all the answers, and students are going to feel more comfortable, because for a lot of kids, this is uncomfortable for them too. It's new for them too. And if they feel like we're in it together, we are a true learning community from student to teacher to student, then okay, it's all right. It's all right if we trip. It's all right if we make mistakes. It's okay if something goes off the rails, and we can have a dialogue about it, and we can really cultivate these communities of learners that are so much stronger in this moment than they've ever been before. But it takes a degree of patience, a degree of I'm ready to experiment, a degree of like I'm willing to be vulnerable as the teacher in this room, in this whatever that room is, and just be with kids and make the best of what is a tough situation for everybody.
Thank you so much. That is really well said. I think I would agree with that. You know, I really want to invite, because we have an audience, we have people watching this. I really want people to say, take the time and be brave and let students try something. I think that might work. Thank you so much. Back to Scott.
Yeah, and I appreciate the emphasis on vulnerability, Catlin. That was really nicely said. We've got about 5 minutes left. We're going to throw you the typical question we ask all our guests, which is that we've developed a lot of new mindsets and beliefs and skill sets over the last 6 to 8 months. What kind of silver linings do you see emerging for learning, teaching, and schooling in the future? What are going to be some positives out of this time? And then with a couple minutes left, we'll hand it over to Kurt to introduce our next episode. So thoughts?
I mean, my hope is that the silver lining is that even in this uncomfortable, like we're being forced to stretch in ways we wouldn't have necessarily like signed up for, that we do start to appreciate the ability of students to be successful learning in an online environment, that we see the benefits of some of that online learning. And when we do return to classrooms, that we don't just say, oh, that's all done, I don't have to deal with that anymore. Instead of feeling like they have to deal with it, like, ooh, how do I weave this into our work in the classroom? I mean, that's very much where my blended learning journey began, right? I was so frustrated by my reality. I was teaching these online courses. I saw potential and I wove it into my practice. And so, you know, that stretching, that uncomfortable space we're in, that's where learning and growth happens, right? But let's not forget to take that back to classrooms when the time comes. And then from a policy perspective, I'd like to really just rethink seat time and where learning has to happen, right? That's just me.
Yeah, thank you, Catlin. I think there's a middle space too, which is not in between teacher level and policy level, which is organizational level, right? And so how do organizations like individual school buildings or school districts lock in some of these new behaviors and practices in ways that are productive in the future, right? It's one thing to have individual teachers to do that, but it's another thing at the organizational level to do that.
Well, and I think as much as some people are like, oh, this moment's crazy, like this pandemic, it's like, it's a pandemic, it's a wildfire, it's a hurricane. It's like, we have to get to a place where learning doesn't get interrupted every single time something infringes on our traditional system. And I think the more that leaders in schools also build into the infrastructure, the fabric of that school and district, how are we going to keep everybody at all levels, administrators, leaders, teachers, students, learning? How do we continue these conversations so they're not relegated to a handful of PD days every year where it's sit and get and everybody hears the same thing, but we allow for this learning to be ongoing and we honor it as part of these cultures that we're creating on school campuses and in districts? Because I think it's so ironic that schools are here to cultivate lifelong learners, and yet we relegate learning for teachers to these like 3 days at the start of the school year or a day here and there. And it's like, no, it needs to be woven into the fabric of everything we do if we're going to be nimble in moments like this.
Absolutely. Catlin, we can't thank you enough for this energetic dynamic discussion and your expertise and enthusiasm. Thank you again for being with us. Kurt, why don't you tell us a little bit about next week's episode?
I'm happy to. Next week, we'll hear from my friend Maxim Jean-Louis, all the way from Thunder Bay. How often do we have a guest from Thunder Bay in our classes? Not often. Actually, he might be in Sudbury, but their headquarters are in Thunder Bay. And that's an organization called Contact North, which is helping design new pedagogies for teaching online. He deals with 22 public universities, 24 public colleges. Hundreds of thousands of people in Ontario use Contact North for their basic skill training. They use video conferencing, teleconferencing, audio conferencing, online learning, and they're designing new models of educating people at Contact North. So it's across the province of Ontario, but hopefully across the entire Canada. And previously it was with Athabasca, the #1 online learning university in Canada. So we're going to hear what's going on at Contact North, and it's pretty fascinating. I've been involved in it. Chris has helped a little bit, and that will be next week with Maxim.
Awesome. Okay, we're at the end of our time. Thank you, everybody. Thanks once again, Catlin. Everybody, goodbye.